beautiful, and welcome to another episode of Beautiful, I Am Colored. My name is Evelyn, and this is the place where I share stories from my debut book that holds the same title as this podcast. I am honored that you have returned to hear more of my stories, and thank you to those of you who tuned in last week. I appreciate your support. For those interested, you can also follow me on Instagram at Beautiful I Am Colored. And if you've enjoyed the stories over the past several weeks, I also would appreciate your support by sharing my podcast or considering subscription. This week, I'll be continuing on and sharing an additional story, just one this week. A short story that is very intimate to me, and it is a place that is still very much tender in my book, and I hope you enjoy it. But before we begin, a little bit of business. Copyright 2022 by E.D. Booth, also known as Evelyn Barnes. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced in any form or by any electronic or mechanical means, including storage and retrieval system, without the written permission of the publisher. There should be 5. I lay there on my back, with tears flowing down my cheeks as the loud, vacuum-like noise stirred in the background. I lay there thinking, why am I here without him? He couldn't take the time to be with me for this? I am not the only one who made this baby. How could I have survived being a pregnant teen mom and be here doing this and married? The guilt was tremendous, and the shame even worse. You call yourself being grown, but here you are throwing a life away, literally. Would I ever be able to get over this? Forgive him again. First the infidelity, now this. I often wonder what it would have been like to raise 5 children instead of 4, but I'll never know. I still feel sad when I think about the little heartbeat I saw displayed on the screen before I had the procedure. It took me years to forgive myself and him. In so many of these negative encounters, I've asked myself what I did to deserve this. The hard truth to face is that sometimes life just happens. But more times than not, it's due to the choices we make. And that's a hard pill to swallow. When we come of age and become independent enough to determine our own outcomes, we must take responsibility for the good, bad, and the ugly of some of our choices. In today's social media climate, we predominantly see people taking credit and being responsible for good choices, which is why the vast majority of social media postings are about moments of perceived happiness, not real life, or at least not the full context of real life. And yes, that goes for my social media accounts too. But I would argue that it's the moments of poor choices and poor decision making that get us to those happy moments. Far more often than acknowledged, the times we fail at things contribute more to our long-term successes than the brief moments of fun and good times. There are far more periods of growth in life than there are fun times or good times. Why is it so hard for us to be transparent and vulnerable to other humans? It is not necessarily easy for me to share some of my life with you, but I'm also aware that in sharing this with you, I'm increasing my level of freedom and abundance in my life because I am choosing not to hold in things that no longer serve me. There was a time when I thought that holding on to these intimate moments brought me a level of false comfort. But false comfort is just that, false. And I have learned that for me to embrace and experience true comfort and peace, I no longer need or desire to hold on to old belief systems or patterns that would have me live a life as less than who I am called to be. Author's comments. So I'm only sharing one story this week because, as you can hear in my voice, this is still a very tender spot for me. And I also want to just advise that this is not to condemn anybody, because I do know that we are living in a very political climate to where abortion is being politicized in a way that is being weaponized on both sides of the political aisle. And so I'm not sharing this story to sway you one way or the other. But if you've listened to the other podcast episodes that I've shared thus far, you'll understand that based on my background, which was heavily Christian, my principles, my morals, and my values were associated with the principles in that of the Bible and the teachings of the Bible. And so when I had the procedure done, all of these things were plaguing me. In the initial paragraph, I share, how could I be there? And just to provide you some context, it was the year 1996. We had just moved to Boulder. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, I encourage you to go back and listen to the other stories. But we had just moved there. At the same time, I had just learned out that, I was being cheated on, and here I am pregnant. I wanted to keep the baby. We had a discussion, and it was very clear that from a financial standpoint that we couldn't afford one. And so for a lot of years, I really truly had a resentment in my heart towards Marlon, because this discussion was more of a financial thing than it was a moral or values type of conversation. And then for me to have to go through such a traumatic experience on my own, quite literally, I drove myself to the place and drove myself back. It was exceptionally traumatic, compounded with all the other things that I've shared with you thus far. And so for me, it took a tremendous amount of work to heal from this. And as you can probably tell, just by listening to me, it's still an area that is tender. That's the proper word for it. It's just tender for me for a host of reasons. But I don't want the listener to feel that I am in any way, shape, or form accusatory. But I will say that the concern that I have in terms of how abortions have been wrapped up and cloaked in reproductive rights, which I do definitely believe in choice. Clearly, I made a choice. But I do think that there is another side, and I know many of you who are listening to me can understand what I'm saying. If you're a woman and ever gone through this process, then you understand, or this procedure, then you understand it's not as simplistic as just going and getting a procedure. Well, let me just speak for myself. It wasn't just as simplistic in going and get a procedure and it being over. Like, your body still goes through a process biologically that still gives you symptoms that you have actually birthed a child into this world, one that is living and breathing. And so I don't take that lightly. The choice period is not likely. And I want to do something a little bit different than I typically do on my podcast, just because this is an area that I know many women have gone through, but it's very little talked about and very little said about it. I want to pivot a little bit, and I would like to offer up a prayer, not just for you, but also for myself. Because regardless of where you fall in terms of your decision making or your choice, I still know that there is a part of you internally that still desires and needs to be healed. And so I can't stress this enough, and I hope that you can hear this in a way that I'm saying it. So I just want to just lift up a prayer. Like I said, this is definitely not typical, but I'm just following my first mind and being led. So I just want to pray for myself and every woman who has gone through this process or this procedure. I pray for healing, and I pray for peace. I pray for peace of mind and restoration. I also pray for forgiveness and forgiveness of self. Maybe it's someone that is out there that was in a position that I was in, to where your belief system, your faith was a challenge to press through in making a decision. And I just want to pray that the sometimes mental chains and the anguish or the deep sadness that could come along with it in terms of grieving, that you are relieved from that, and that I am relieved from that. And that as I continue to be vulnerable and share stories with you, that more people will be able to have the tough conversations and talk and heal from these processes. Amen, amen, and amen. Okay, this was a rough one for me, guys. I am not going to record over this. I'm not going to redo this. This was a rough one for me this week, which is why we're only sharing one story, or I'm sharing one story with you. As always, I want to thank you so much for tuning in, for listening. I sincerely appreciate your support. And if my stories have touched you in some way, if you feel like you would like to support me, I certainly would appreciate your support and consideration in subscribing to one of the podcast platforms that I'm on, or just sharing this message with someone who you feel may need to hear it. Until next time, beautiful, I hope that you have a great weekend, a wonderful weekend. I'm going to restore myself and be prepared for you for next week's stories. Until then, beautiful, have an amazing week.